A chilling introduction, the crime that stunned America. That snowy December in 1971, the small, affluent community of Westfield, New Jersey, was about to become ground zero for one of the most chilling and baffling crimes in American history. It wasn't the kind of town where people even bothered locking their doors, where the biggest local drama usually played out during high school football games or PTA meetings. But all that changed with the headline that would freeze every parent's heart and scramble the sense of safety that families had long taken for granted. John List, an ordinary-seeming accountant and devoted churchgoer, embodied everything this town claimed to value: stability, respectability, success. To outward appearances, he was the perfect neighbor, quiet, polite, always dressed in a pressed suit, waving to passers-by on his way to the train each morning. No one could have guessed the horror brewing behind the doors of the List family's stately mansion on Hillside Avenue, a home that, for all its grandeur, would soon give up a secret darker than any ghost story. What began as whispers around the block, "Why are the lights always burning in the List house night and day?" quickly escalated into concern and dread. The mail had begun to stack up, milk deliveries went untouched, and the high-glass windows, once a symbol of the family's sophistication, now glimmered with a haunting vacancy. There was no sign of the 5 List family members: John, his wife Helen, their 3 children, and John's elderly mother. Months earlier, they were seen together at church, John leading his family with the uptight grace of a man desperate to keep up appearances. When police finally gained access to the List mansion after weeks of silence, they stepped into a scene that would haunt both the town and the nation. Gone was the warm hum of family, replaced by a chilling coldness. The heating system turned off, Bach's sacred music echoing through empty, drafty halls. In the ballroom, under the dim light filtering through drawn curtains, lay the bodies, each carefully arranged on sleeping bags as if tucked in for the world's loneliest slumber party. Upstairs, John's mother was found lifeless in her attic suite. Each victim had been shot methodically, leaving no room for doubt. This was no burglary gone wrong, no accident, but a calculated act of family annihilation. On the dining room table rested a letter, 5 pages long, painstakingly written in John List's tidy hand. Its contents would later become almost as infamous as the crime itself: confessions not just of murder, but of a tortured, bankrupt soul's attempt to justify the unthinkable. The List case did more than shatter a family. It pierced the American dream at its core, leaving the country to wonder if darkness could fester inside a house as stately and a family as seemingly perfect as the Lists. What secrets might their own neighbors hide? That was the day the word unthinkable found a new definition in the American vocabulary. The List murders didn't just shock Westfield, they rippled out, sparking debate on the fragility of appearances, mental health, and the quiet desperation that can breed behind the safest suburban facades. To this day, the mention of John List is enough to send chills down the spine, a reminder that evil doesn't always come with a warning, and that sometimes monsters wear a neighbor's friendly face. The model family and secrets in the mansion. From the outside, the List family seemed to have every box on the American Dream checklist ticked. Perched grandly on a leafy street in Westfield, New Jersey, their 19-room Victorian mansion radiated old-money respectability. Stained glass windows, ornate woodwork, and manicured hedges told neighbors that stability and tradition lived here. John List, the stern but soft-spoken patriarch, cut the figure of suburban success. A devout Lutheran, neatly dressed in crisp suits no matter the occasion, and upstanding to a fault. His wife Helen, though reserved, was always seen in pearls and pressed blouses, exchanging polite greetings at the market. Their 3 children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick, looked every bit the part of wholesome, well-groomed kids, shuttled from choir practice to school recitals. But those immaculate walls, that meticulous lawn, none told the story percolating in anxious whispers behind the front door. The List home existed in a strange, self-contained orbit, its daily rhythm played out in rituals that, in retrospect, hinted at unease. Helen, once vivacious, started fading into the background, weighed down by illness and a melancholy that cast a long shadow through the halls. She could often be glimpsed peering through upstairs curtains or sitting quietly in the sunroom, lost in her own world. On Sundays, the entire family filed into their pew with military precision, but Helen's smile only flickered briefly, gone just as quickly as it appeared. John, plagued by financial woes he kept tightly hidden, clung to the outward trappings of success. Each morning, he left the house at the same hour, briefcase in hand, suit pressed to perfection. Yet unbeknownst to anyone, his days were spent not at the office, but sitting stone-faced at the train station, hoping no one in town would notice he'd lost his job. Pride would not allow him to confess. Instead, unpaid bills quietly mounted on the antique desk in his study, concealed under stacks of church bulletins and financial statements. John's mother, Alma, still fiercely independent in her 80s, occupied the attic, holding court above the drama unfolding down below. The children noticed their mother's absences and their father's brittle mood. Patricia, the eldest, confided to a teacher her unease, that something was off at home, though she longed to protect her family's secret. She sensed the coldness creeping into family life, the tension at the dinner table growing heavier week by week. Family meals became strained ceremonies, with Helen often silent and John issuing tense, forced conversations about grades and chores. The neighborhood saw only what it wanted to see: a family keeping up appearances, locking arms around old-fashioned values. But beneath the polished veneer, isolation took root, a perfect storm of disappointment, fear, and the desperate hope that if they just pretended long enough, everything might hold together. No one could know just how threadbare that illusion had become, or how close the List mansion was to becoming the site of an unthinkable tragedy. A month of terrifying silence. The first oddity was subtle, almost dismissible. A porch light left burning overnight, a shade drawn a little too tightly. In a close-knit suburb like Westfield, quirks pass for character, but as December crept on, the little curiosities at the List mansion began to snowball into something unmistakably chilling. Neighbor after neighbor remembered glancing up at those tall Victorian windows and seeing light, always light, streaming from every room regardless of hour. The typically economical, almost obsessive John List had never been known for extravagance, yet his home blazed like a beacon on even the coldest winter nights. Some neighbors attributed it to holiday spirit. Maybe the Lists were feeling festive despite the weather, but as the days wore on, that cheerful theory withered. No cars came or went, no one answered the door, no laughter, no music seeped out onto the frosty street. Mail and parcels, once swept up daily, piled on the porch, mingling with yellowing newspapers and abandoned milk bottles. Delivery men knocked, got no response, and eventually gave up. Curious neighbors, hesitant but uneasy, tiptoed up to peer through leaded glass, only to find the world within as dim and impenetrable as ever. But it was the silence that unsettled them most. In a community where children's shouts bounced from yard to yard and the clatter of family dinners filled the twilight, the absence of any List peep rang louder than a siren. Some neighbors voiced their discomfort at block parties or whispered in the pews at church. Had anyone seen Patricia at school? Did Helen still come around for groceries? Conversations always trailed off, replaced by worried glances. As one week passed, then another, the lights began to sputter out, bulbs burning right through their filament and dying one by one. It turned the house into a tableau of abandonment, a beacon first, now a mausoleum. The unspoken dread became harder to ignore. The children hadn't shown up for school, Helen wasn't seen at church, John's meticulous routines had vanished. When at last a neighbor worked up the nerve to call the police, it was almost with a sense of reluctant relief. The dreadful waiting was over. Now at least someone with authority would step inside and put an end to the steady, creeping horror. But when the authorities finally broke through a basement window, their entry would turn a month of anxious speculation into a lifetime of collective trauma for the neighborhood. What was left behind was an eerie, frozen moment in time, the legacy of 4 weeks when silence itself became a harbinger of the unthinkable, and a town that had always felt so safe learned that darkness can thrive, even behind the brightest of lights. The cold house and haunting church music. Stepping across the threshold of the List mansion was like entering a mausoleum preserved in time and sorrow. The air inside was bitingly cold. The heating system had been deliberately switched off, letting the winter seep into every corner and fill the halls with a bitter chill. But what struck the officers and investigators even more than the temperature was the sound. Floating eerily through every corridor, echoing down the grand staircase and slipping beneath tightly shut doors, was the melancholy swell of church hymns. The music didn't come from a dusty piano or a forgotten radio. It filtered through the mansion's old-fashioned intercom system, as if the house itself mourned. Bach's sacred compositions bled through the silence, holy and haunting in equal measure, so at odds with the grim tableau that awaited discovery. The ballrooms and parlors, once designed for laughter, family gatherings, and elegant soirees, were now perfumed with the loneliness of sacred song, the notes drifting and curling in the frigid air. It was a detail so painfully deliberate, investigators would later recall, a musical send-off for the dead. The juxtaposition of those timeless hymns against the emptiness and the horror of what had transpired inside amplified every sensation, making even the most experienced officers shudder. Some would carry the memory of walking through those icy halls, their breath misting visibly, footsteps echoing on polished hardwood long after the case was closed. There were no ordinary sounds of abandonment, no ticking clocks, no rattling pipes, no barking dogs or humming appliances. Only the persistent, chilling comfort of spiritual melodies, chosen by John List not just for himself, but as a grim farewell for the family he'd left behind. These songs were not for the living. They turned the mansion into a sanctuary of loss, a space frozen in lament, radiating an unsettling peace that was truly, deeply sinister. Gruesome discovery in ballroom. The frigid grandeur of the List Mansion's ballroom was forever transformed on the day investigators crossed its threshold. The officers, shoulders squared in forced professionalism, were greeted by a scene more suited for a Gothic ghost story than a New Jersey suburb. The once glittering centerpiece of the house, with its high sculpted ceilings and polished wooden floor, had become a silent stage for tragedy. Laid out with eerie precision on faded sleeping bags, John List's wife and 3 children formed a haunting tableau. Their bodies, carefully aligned side by side as though for a resting ritual, seemed almost peacefully asleep beneath the cavernous expanse, until the officers saw the bullet wounds at each temple. The air was cold and devoid of the living smells of a home. No hint of baked goods or family dinners, only the sterile tang of old wood and something darker. Dust motes drifted languidly in the frosted light, falling onto faces now forever frozen in a moment of betrayal and loss. The silence within the ballroom was heavy, pressing down on every observer. Officers exchanged hesitant, almost reverent glances, aware they were witnessing the aftermath of something chillingly orchestrated and intimate. The sleeping bags, a choice so deliberate, suggested a mock comfort, a final and grotesque mimicry of parental care, a family meeting their end where once they might have danced or celebrated. There was no sign of a struggle. Items around the room remained undisturbed, the family's last moments shrouded in the quiet horror of routine interrupted. Upstairs, the discovery of John List's elderly mother added another distressing note. Alone in her attic apartment, she too had been killed with a single precise shot. Her rooms, with their relics and reminders of a bygone era, had become her mausoleum. Even here in the upper reaches of the grand house, the reality of violence had seeped silently, leaving behind only stillness and death. For investigators, the ballroom's cruel orderliness made the crime all the more disturbing. This was no discordant frenzy of violence. Each body, each detail seemed part of a calculated plan. The scene spoke not of rage, but of cold resolve. Even the details, the children's small possessions left nearby, the faint imprint of a hand on a pillow, offered heartbreaking echoes of the family's interrupted story. In that grand dancing room, the normal rhythms of suburban life gave way to tragedy, and the house itself seemed to mourn alongside the living. 1. Confession letter, chilling last words. The letter sat squarely at the center of the polished oak desk, its neat folds and crisp edges in startling contrast to the chaos it concealed. 5 pages written in an unwavering, almost mechanical hand, each line precise and deliberate, much like the man who had composed them. When detectives finally broke the seal and began to read, they were struck first by the obsessive orderliness, the date and salutation, the margins straight as a ruler's edge, the handwriting steady, betraying no hint of panic or haste. This was not a frantic confession, not the desperate babble of a person pushed to the brink. It was instead an accounting, a rationale, a farewell stitched with cold rationale and tangled faith. John List addressed the letter to his pastor, Reverend Eugene Rewinkle, as if reaching for an anchor in a moment of collapse. The crime had shattered the quiet of Westfield, but the letter threatened to shatter any remnants of understanding. "Dear Pastor," John began, the same way he might have started a note about a parish committee meeting or a family request, but what followed quickly veered into the unfathomable. "I am sorry to add this additional burden to your work," he wrote, admitting almost immediately that his actions would burden more than just his conscience. He explained, or tried to, why he had taken the lives of every member of his family. Money, he wrote, had always been a concern. He confessed to losing his job months prior and to hiding the truth from his family. He was drowning in bills, mortgage payments overdue, savings evaporated, the facade of prosperity crumbling wall by wall. In the letter, John laid out his twisted logic, that the disgrace of bankruptcy would be far worse for his family than death. He wrote that Helen, his wife, was seriously ill, and he claimed to spare her the indignities and anxieties that lay ahead. About his children he agonized, on the page if not in reality, that he feared their faith was slipping, that they would fall away from God if left to face the hostile world without his guidance. There was an eerie calmness in his prose, an absence of overt remorse replaced by a prosecutorial self-justification. John meticulously accounted for each decision, what time he acted, why he moved certain bodies, why he played Bach's sacred songs throughout the house. He explained that he had arranged each member of the family on sleeping bags because it seemed more respectful, less cold and brutal than leaving them where they fell. Yet that chill saturated every word. At least now they are all in heaven, he offered, as if that rationalization could absolve the sheer violence of his choices. The tone fluttered between piety and calculation, hinting at a fundamental fracture beneath the surface calm. John's references to Scripture, to his fears of a godless world, to the salvation of souls, these all wove a strange, dissonant tapestry with the methodical brutality he'd just committed. He did not confess in the sense the police or the world would expect. There were no pleas for forgiveness directed at the victims, only soft-spoken apologies aimed at his pastor and church. Here he seemed preoccupied not by the horror left behind, but by concerns about the bills to be paid, the practicality of funeral arrangements, and the care of the family dog. Even in confession he defaulted to logistics and order, as if murder could be organized into a ledger along with so many other life failures. Detectives and counselors who later read the letter would remark on its peculiar blend of detachment and sentimentality. Sometimes, John's voice slipped into that of an anxious father or dutiful husband, momentarily breaking through the cold logic to express something like longing or regret, but that warmth quickly retreated behind justifications and Bible verses. In one passage he described sitting at his empty kitchen table, ruminating on the burdens of the world and the certainty that only he could make the necessary decision. Sometimes his words contradicted themselves, 1 minute mourning the loss of family bonds, the next rationalizing their erasure as if it was a kindness. He detailed the sequence of events with clinical clarity. He wrote of approaching Helen first, then his mother, and finally his children as they returned home from school one by one. The specifics were chilling, not only the timeline but the methodical nature. John described how he ensured there would be no alarm, how the house lights stayed on to delay suspicion, why milk deliveries and mail would go unanswered. The letter was equal parts confession and instruction manual, a document to tidy the loose ends of a ruined life. But perhaps the letter's most haunting aspect was its total lack of uncertainty. There were no questions, no grappling, only conclusions. John List saw himself not as a man overtaken by desperation or darkness, but as a servant carrying out an unthinkable but righteous mission. The repeated invocation of God's will did little to disguise the calculated secular motives of pride and control. His final lines were as chilling as the crime, a wish for understanding where none could exist, expressed with the hollow politeness of a business memo. The police, the pastor, and later the nation would struggle to comprehend the void between the facade of order John maintained and the havoc he had wrought. Some saw the letter as proof of deep, untreated mental illness. Others viewed it as the product of a cold, self-obsessed narcissist unable to accept defeat. Either way, those 5 pages became infamous, less for the answers they provided than for the endless, shuddering questions they unleashed about the quiet terror that can lurk beneath the surface of the most perfect families. Elaborate escape plan. In the days following the brutal discovery at the List mansion, no one could have imagined just how meticulously John List had choreographed his own disappearance. Beneath the mask of the methodical, church-going family man always striving for perfection, there had been a mind quietly preparing for escape, a plan so precise and coldly rational that it would dazzle investigators for years to come. As the police pieced together the sequence of events, it became clear that every step was calculated. Even before the murders occurred, John had set things in motion to erase his presence not just from his home, but from the fabric of his own life. He began by withdrawing large sums of money from the family bank accounts in the months leading up to the tragedy, nothing extravagant enough to raise alarms, but enough to get a head start if and when he needed to vanish. He maintained outwardly normal routines, keeping up daily appearances at the train station, his church obligations, and the occasional community function, hoping to leave no sign of nervousness or deviation that might later come back to haunt him. His actions on the day of the murders speak volumes about his foresight and his icy detachment. After ending the lives of his wife, mother, and children one by one, John took hours to clean up and organize their bodies, even as he set the stage for what he likely imagined would be a period of confusion and delay. He called each child home from school separately, making sure their arrivals would not overlap, minimizing the risk of commotion or alarm that would attract unwanted attention from the outside. Once the family was dead and arranged in the ballroom, John set about erasing himself as a person, step by deliberate step. He began the process of vanishing with an act almost theatrical in its symbolism. He meticulously went through the family albums and removed his face from every photograph. Snip by deliberate snip, he detached himself from his own past, ensuring that if authorities put out a bulletin or distributed the List family portraits, there would be no clear reference for what John List actually looked like. In a pre-digital era, this act proved surprisingly effective, leaving the investigators and later the FBI with only outdated descriptions and vague artist renderings. From there, List began to dismantle the physical evidence of his identity. He destroyed his personal documents, shredding his passport, social security card, and various forms of identification, making it almost impossible for anyone to track his next moves through routine bureaucratic channels. Bank statements, utility bills, and any traceable clues tied to his name were burned, trashed, or otherwise made to disappear. Each act was desperate yet astonishingly neat, reflecting the paradox at the heart of the man himself, a compulsive need for control even as he orchestrated chaos. John didn't stop with his own personal artifacts. He mailed carefully worded letters to his children's schools, notifying administration that the family would be leaving town to care for a sick relative out west. He canceled milk deliveries and ordered a hold on all mail and newspaper services, knowing, in a town like Westfield, that regular everyday service disruptions would stave off suspicion just long enough for him to get a critical head start. All the while, the lights in the mansion burned on timers, making it appear that someone was still living there. Once these practicalities had been attended to, John List made good on his escape plan. Well before police realized something was terribly wrong, he had packed a single suitcase, taking only the bare minimum, a couple of suits, some cash, and the few personal keepsakes he was not prepared to destroy. He left his car parked at the airport, bought a bus ticket under an assumed name, and traveled first to another city and then westward, careful to change his method of transportation at multiple points, a move designed to further muddy any potential paper trail. Every decision was driven by one chilling priority: do not be found. On the day he fled, List made one final call to his workplace, where no one yet suspected anything amiss, leaving a message that he would not be returning due to family matters, once again pressing the illusion of normality just long enough to avoid immediate suspicion. He wore cheap, easily replaceable glasses and altered his appearance as much as possible, trimming or shaving facial hair, styling his hair differently, and wearing off-the-rack clothing that wouldn't attract second glances. What's even more remarkable in retrospect is that List knew how to blend seamlessly into the tapestry of mid-century American life. He gravitated toward places where an anonymous man with few possessions could disappear: a boarding house, a low-cost motel, a second-hand clothing store. He found work under the table, drifted between cities, and never lingered long enough in any place to put down roots or spark curiosity. Throughout this ordeal, John List always seemed to be thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. He had read stories of other fugitives and took careful notes, avoiding the use of credit cards, steering clear of locations with heavy surveillance or where most wanted posters might be displayed. He kept conversations with strangers simple, never let slip details about his past, and prepared a rehearsed script about moving for work or being estranged from family. When he eventually landed in Denver, Colorado, a city big enough to offer anonymity but unremarkable in its day-to-day bustle, List was just one more face in a sprawling crowd. Back in Westfield, days bled into weeks as local authorities scrambled to piece together the timeline, increasingly baffled by the utter lack of credible leads, the absence of John List from any conceivable flight path. Airports, train stations, car rentals remained one of the most frustrating dead ends in the entire investigation. His vanishing act was so effective that, for a while, some officers wondered aloud whether he had somehow perished in the chaos or if he had used professional help. But the painstaking trail of mundane yet cleverly orchestrated actions pointed instead to a man whose capacity for self-erasure was nearly unparalleled. Over the next 18 years, John List would drift through a series of nondescript neighborhoods, changing names and jobs as often as the seasons shifted. He never called attention to himself, never wrote or called old friends, never left a breadcrumb for the law. It was, in a way, the final and most unthinkable illusion of normalcy, one that lasted until the day television and the persistence of modern technology finally caught up with him. A life lived in hiding under the identity of Robert Clark. After his orchestrated disappearance from Westfield, John List transformed into a completely new man, donning the identity of Robert Peter Clark the moment he stepped off the bus in Denver. If his original life in New Jersey had been defined by ritual and painful pride, his fugitive existence was calculated to be the very opposite. Anonymous, transient, featureless, a man determined to dissolve into the background of American life. Denver at the time was a city in flux, growing, bustling, a magnet for people seeking second chances or simply running from something. It was the perfect place for a man who needed desperately not to be seen. John List, now Robert Clark, arrived with nothing that would tie him to his past. No family photos, no personal effects, nothing but a carefully packed suitcase and a head filled with logistical blueprints for survival. His nerves were raw for weeks, every police siren in the night causing a shiver, every glance from a stranger met with a practiced, non-committal smile. He developed routines of deep caution, never walking the same route twice in a row, never leading acquaintances near the place he called home, always paying cash for everything. Working odd jobs was the first layer in his camouflage. John had never worked with his hands much, but as Robert Clark, he took whatever honest labor he could get. He started as a kitchen assistant at a small diner, scrubbing dishes, peeling potatoes, and keeping as quiet as possible. Menial as it was, the job suited his purpose. Nobody in a transient workforce asks too many questions, and turnover was high enough that faces faded from memory quickly. He kept his answers generic, rehearsed. Moved here for a change. No family to speak of. Just looking to get back on my feet. If someone asked where he'd grown up, he spun stories about distant relatives in the Midwest, a mix of plausibility and forgettability. He grew a mustache, styled his hair differently every few weeks, wore oversized glasses, and favored ill-fitting thrift store suits that shaded him further in anonymity. Out of habit, he avoided any mention of the faith and family traditions that had once structured his life. Despite his deliberate isolation, John, now Robert, couldn't fully shed the old habits of order and discipline. He rented a Spartan room in a boarding house, paying a month at a time and always a bit in advance to avoid suspicion. His meager wages were split meticulously between rent, food, and a slowly growing nest egg kept in cash under a loose floorboard. Every receipt, every inconsequential slip of paper was burned or meticulously shredded and scattered in public trash cans, far from his home or work. The loneliness was stifling at first. In Westfield, John had been an avid churchgoer, father, and fixture of neighborhood routines. As Robert Clark, he became a ghost in his own life. He spent evenings reading old library books at his rented room's desk, the walls bare and undecorated, and he rarely ventured outside except for work or supplies. Sometimes, on nights when he felt the cold of old guilt, he'd ride the city bus for hours, watching the city lights blur past, comforted by the anonymity of crowds. Yet, paradoxically, he needed to build just enough of a mundane, benign existence to avoid arousing suspicion. He started attending a small Lutheran church on Denver's quieter edge, introducing himself simply as Robert, a recent arrival with no local family ties. He volunteered for menial church tasks, setting out hymnals, tidying pews, mowing grass. His knowledge of Scripture was deep enough to impress, but he was always humble and vague about his past congregation, citing a string of moves and personal misfortunes that kept attentive questioners at bay. List's ability to blend was unnerving. He never overplayed his hand, never drew attention. He listened more than he spoke and was friendly but reserved. Co-workers and parishioners described him as utterly ordinary, a little dull, pleasant enough, and impossible to imagine as anything but a middle-aged bachelor starting life over. The discipline of vanishing became second nature. He even rehearsed different versions of his backstory at home so that he would never hesitate if someone, someday, pressed him for detail. Companionship, however, has a way of sneaking up, even on those determined to repel it. After nearly a decade of moving from job to job, dishwasher, night janitor, short-order cook, thrift shop clerk, Robert Clark allowed himself little by little to enter the periphery of church social life. He lingered at after-service coffee, occasionally attended potlucks, and eventually struck up passing conversation with Dolores Miller, a fellow parishioner, herself divorced and estranged from her family. She found his shyness charming, his tendency to listen a rare virtue, and his lack of history something she could relate to rather than suspect. Their relationship developed quietly, slowly, two people with shadows in their pasts building something resembling trust. To Dolores, Robert was a godsend, older, reliable, careful with money, never prone to anger, never raising his voice. To John, still John somewhere inside, Dolores represented both salvation and threat, the first real risk of exposure since Westfield, but also a chance to be seen as good again. By the time they married in a modest church ceremony, he believed he had finally pulled it off. The reinvention, the erasure, the death of John List. Marriage brought slightly more stability. The couple pooled their modest resources, renting a small brick house in Aurora, a suburb east of Denver. John took a longer-term job as an accountant for a small firm, leveraging a forged resume and the ease with which background checks could be skirted in the pre-digital age. Dolores found work at a nearby medical office. Their life became routine: early breakfasts, separate commutes, dinner at home, television game shows, the odd church supper, and religious holidays observed simply but punctually. They never traveled, rarely entertained, and carefully avoided any situation that might put their pasts under a microscope. Sometimes, despite every outward sign of normalcy, the truth pressed at the corners of John's mind. He remained vigilant, listening, not just to Dolores but to the world around him, news reports, church gossip, workplace chatter. He never subscribed to newspapers and read only books borrowed from libraries in other neighborhoods. Though surveillance technology in the 80s was primitive by modern standards, he exercised extreme caution, never allowing his photograph to be taken at church events or company parties, and throwing out any mail addressed to Robert Clark with even a hint of unknown origin. There were moments of terror, familiar faces glimpsed on the street, police cars parked nearby, nights where he lay awake, convinced that the knock on the door was finally coming. Still, days turned to months and months to years, and what began as fear gradually congealed into a numb, grinding routine. Robert Clark became, in all outward ways, a strictly average citizen, unobtrusive, frugal, occasionally somber, generally kind. In his private moments he allowed himself brief reflection on the life he'd left behind, but always stopped short of true confession, even to himself. New marriage and the belief in escaping the past. After years of blending into the bland tapestry of small-town life as Robert Peter Clark, John List finally let himself drift into the gentle orbit of companionship again. It started tentatively: quiet nods at church services, brief conversations after Sunday coffee, the slow thaw that comes when two solitary people recognize the same tinge of loneliness in each other's eyes. Dolores Miller was nothing like Helen, his first wife. She was pragmatic, warm yet non-intrusive, herself a survivor of heartache after a bitter divorce. Their first real conversation took place at a potluck dinner, with John, now Robert, serving up bland potato salad and Dolores talking softly about her garden. There was no spark, no grand romantic gesture, just an odd, soothing sense of being seen without scrutiny. Dolores was drawn to Robert's steadiness. Here was a man who didn't speak much about his past, but who never raised his voice, never drank too much, always paid his bills on time, and seemed content to be quietly useful. He'd offer to mow the church lawn, fix leaky faucets, or drive neighbors to appointments, always dependable, always a little distant. Dolores, too, was self-sufficient and valued her independence, but the growing companionship between the two surprised both of them. Slowly, Robert let himself lean into routine, finding comfort in the shared silences and small acts of everyday life. Their courtship was unremarkable, intentionally so. John List still lived in constant underlying fear. Every knock at the door or glance from a stranger could unravel his carefully built new world, but Dolores's gentle patience lulled him into something akin to peace. She accepted that he didn't talk about his childhood or family, never pressed him about his roots, and let him remain simply a man, restarting late in life. In her presence, the noise of John's old anxieties sometimes faded, replaced by the calming, methodical rhythm of domesticity. It took 8 years before Dolores and Robert decided to marry, and even then, everything was cautious, understated. They chose a modest ceremony at the same church where they'd first met, attended by a handful of friends. At the altar, John List, heart racing with a secret fear, recited his vows, repeating words about honesty and devotion that pressed hard against his private burdens. Still, when Dolores squeezed his hand and he saw her quiet smile, he felt, for the first time in decades, a glimmer of hope that maybe the past really was gone, receding behind him like a bad dream upon waking. Their home in Aurora, Colorado was neat and small, filled with the hum of daily rituals. Dolores rose early and tended to her potted plants on the porch. John, as Robert, made a bland breakfast and packed their lunches with almost military precision. They wrote grocery lists together, budgeted their expenses down to the dollar, and organized their closets like a pair of seasoned survivors. Neither of them was given to outbursts of affection. Their bond was quieter, a soft, persistent companionship forged in mutual respect and the comfort of predictability. Nonetheless, beneath Robert Clark's composed surface, John List's guilt and obsessions still churned. Flashes of his old life broke through the routine. A song on the radio, the scent of a certain cooking oil, the pattern of winter sunlight through a window. Sometimes John would linger late at his accounting job, double-checking numbers long after everyone else had gone home, fearful someone would peer too closely at his forged resume or question his references. Each time Dolores asked about his past, he gently dodged the topic, opting instead to ask about her day, her ex-husband, her favorite books. Dolores, for her part, found Robert's reticence endearing, if sometimes odd. She figured that everyone had their old wounds to carry and that his, whatever they might have been, simply ran deep. If she sometimes caught him staring out the window for hours or found him shuffling nervously whenever the news featured stories of fugitives or notorious crimes, she chalked it up to normal, if quirky, human frailty. She never dug for details. They had both, in their ways, remade themselves. Church continued to be the anchor of their social life. Robert volunteered to keep church books balanced and to usher on Sunday mornings, while Dolores joined the quilting circle and organized charitable drives. They rarely hosted guests, maintaining a polite but distant relationship with neighbors, kind but never close. Holidays were marked simply, with John retreating into work and Dolores losing herself in puzzles or novels. They gave each other space, a gift in its way greater than any showy bouquet or romantic holiday trip. Yet the specter of John List's old life never fully lifted. Every day he scanned the faces in church and at the store, searching for a spark of recognition, someone from New Jersey, a nosy neighbor who saw too much, a television camera pointed his way. Each Christmas, he found himself haunted by thoughts of his lost children, his abandoned faith, and the echoing ruin of his old home. He prayed often for forgiveness, but never spoke the words aloud to Dolores. Perhaps, he sometimes told himself, all those years of good behavior could redeem what he'd done, that the God he worshipped in silence might tally up his penance and grant him peace. Dolores, meanwhile, treasured the stability Robert brought. After years of upheaval, his presence steadied her. She never understood, never could have guessed, the depth of fear that shaped every one of her new husband's choices. If she sometimes sighed at his old-fashioned morals or wondered at his reluctance to celebrate anything boisterously, she accepted it as part of who he was. She trusted him, in the understated bone-deep way that comes from weathering life's storms and settling into something that feels safe, even if, for John List, safety was always just a fragile illusion away from shattering. In the end, their marriage was defined not by passion or grand adventures, but by the nightly settling of routines. The clink of cutlery at dinner, the quiet turn of pages in bed, the shared prayers, his silent, hers whispered softly in the dark. For John List, now Robert Clark, it was as close to absolution as he ever imagined he'd find in this world. But try as he might, he could never fully convince himself that he was safe from the past. There was always the faintest echo, a rumor of footsteps, a sense that someday, somehow, the truth would come knocking, and the life he'd painstakingly constructed would collapse once more into silence. Moment of recognition through television and technology. The night of May 21, 1989, started out like any other Sunday across the country. Families crowding around television sets, ready for a last dose of weekend entertainment before another week began. But in countless living rooms, the glow of the TV brought not comfort, but a reminder that even decades-old dread can return. America's Most Wanted was airing its latest episode, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the name John List was about to thunder through American consciousness again. The producers had chosen the List case for good reason, a notorious family annihilator who had vanished without a trace, thought by many to be dead. But there was a new technological twist. Instead of old, grainy photos, viewers were greeted by a hyper-realistic clay bust, painstakingly sculpted by renowned forensic artist Frank Bender. It was a feat of science and imagination, a prediction of John List's current appearance, aged 18 years from his last known photographs. His hair now grayer, cheeks a bit more hollow, glasses thick over wary eyes. Bender had considered the way stress etched lines across a man's face, how remorse might stoop his shoulders, or worry deepen the set of his mouth. The result was uncanny, almost ghostly, an extraordinary marriage of artistry and criminal science. That Sunday evening, the List segment unfolded with an ominous crescendo. The host recounted the grisly discovery in Westfield, played bits of old newsreels over pan shots of the once stately mansion. They reviewed John List's meticulous preparations, the chilling farewell letter, and the strange emptiness left in his wake. The camera panned to the bust, lingering for an extra beat. "If you recognize this man, call our hotline. He may go by another name. He is considered dangerous and must not be approached." What no one foresaw was just how much this new technology, the composite bust, would cut through the years of evasion like a searchlight. In a modest home in Denver, a woman named Wanda Flannery sat bolt upright as the segment played. She wasn't looking at John List, at least not by the name she knew him. What she saw was Robert Peter Clark, her neighbor from across the hall, the reserved man who never spoke much about his past but always greeted her with a kind, if distant, smile. The resemblance was, as she would later say, so exact it made me cold all over. Wanda's heart raced as she weighed what she had just seen. There was no drama, no villainous sneer, just the familiar slightly stooped posture, the same careful way of holding himself, perhaps even the soft cadence of his walk down the hallway. Could Robert actually be the man now broadcast as one of America's most wanted fugitives? She debated for hours, torn between fear of making a terrible mistake and the gnawing suspicion that this was no ordinary case of mistaken identity. In the end, civic duty, and a tinge of dread, pushed her to call the FBI tip line. "My neighbor, Robert Clark, looks just like the man on TV," she said, her voice trembling, "and I think it's him, I really do." The call sparked a quiet, methodical investigation. Within days, federal agents canvassed the area, careful not to stir alarm but intensely focused, narrowing in on Clark's modest suburban home in Richmond, Virginia, where he and Dolores had relocated in recent years. They set up discreet surveillance, collecting trash and analyzing handwriting, all while blending in like the anonymous neighbors Robert had always tried so hard to become. Meanwhile, inside the Clark household, John List's carefully rehearsed routine carried on with the same precise monotony. He made breakfast for Dolores, drove to his accounting job, mowed the church lawn. Yet something in the air had changed. Perhaps it was the way Dolores paused at the evening news, or the new set of eyes he felt on him at the grocery store. If John sensed the net closing, he gave no outward sign. He had, after all, spent nearly 20 years perfecting the art of emotional camouflage. But the science had outpaced his recalculations. Investigators had compared the application for Robert Clark's Social Security card with old List documents, and noted subtle but distinctive similarities in penmanship. A single fingerprint from a job application matched a smudged print found on an old List family document. Piece by piece, the paper-thin facade began to crack. By now, the FBI was certain. They found their man. On June 1, 1989, the illusion finally ruptured. Federal marshals, together with local police, descended quietly on Robert Clark's tidy brick house at sunrise. Dolores answered the door still in her robe, and John, startled out of breakfast with his usual calm, at first insisted there must have been some mistake. But the agents were thorough. "John Emil List, you are under arrest." For a moment, the retired accountant simply stood, frozen in place, as if even now he could will his secret life to remain intact by sheer force of routine. His arrest was cautious, almost anticlimactic. There were no outbursts, no dramatic chase, just a quiet, drawn-out sigh as the man who had lived 1,000 careful days surrendered to the reality he so desperately tried to outpace. Dolores looked on, bewildered, as the man she thought she knew was led silently away in handcuffs, overwhelmed by a truth too convoluted to process on the spot. News of John List's capture raced quickly across the country. Within hours, neighbors in both Denver and Richmond found themselves reeling in disbelief. To them, Robert Clark had been the definition of ordinary. Polite, neat, a bit withdrawn. Local clergy and co-workers now scoured their memories for anything odd, any warning they might have missed. while the larger public was spellbound by a case that seemed ripped from fiction. Television crews crowded outside List's home and at the New Jersey crime scene, dissecting every twist of the two-decade saga. For the investigators, there was a moment of awe at how seamlessly List had faded into American anonymity, as if camouflage itself could become a kind of virtue. Yet it was the combination of old-fashioned observation, a neighbor's intuition, and modern forensic artistry that finally closed the distance between the notorious past and mundane present. Frank Bender, the artist, described feeling chills when he saw photographs of List after the arrest. "I could hardly believe it. It was like seeing my sculpture get up and walk." The accuracy was so remarkable it set a new bar for forensic reconstructions nationwide. Back in custody, John List was strangely calm. At his arraignment, he spoke quietly and with the same measured politeness that had marked his life in hiding, yet beneath his composure there ran an undercurrent of resignation, a man who, having evaded justice for nearly half his lifetime, could no longer maintain the illusion of control. He requested a lawyer, gave few details, and allowed himself to be processed through the system like any other criminal who had finally run out of space to hide. It was only later that the magnitude of what had transpired would come to rest on him, his family, and the American psyche, that the past, no matter how artfully concealed, can still find new life through a television signal, a clay bust, and the quiet determination of a neighbor who refused to look away. The sensational trial, the fateful letter. The courtroom was tense, every seat filled by journalists, law enforcement, and citizens drawn by the sheer infamy of the case, a spectacle few would ever forget. Nearly 2 decades after the unspeakable crimes in the List mansion, John Emil List was finally being tried for the murders of his wife, 3 children, and mother. As the proceedings began, it was hard to believe the quiet, elderly figure in handcuffs was the same man who had vanished so completely into the American landscape. There was a strange disconnect between the mild-mannered Robert Clark and the methodical family annihilator conjured by years of headlines and urban legend. The trial opened with the prosecution laying out the chilling facts. Using photographs, testimonies, and forensic evidence, the state painted a picture of the List household's final days, the mounting debts, John List's secret unemployment, the calculated sequence of the killings, and ultimately, that now infamous 5-page confession letter addressed to his pastor. The letter itself became the centerpiece of the trial. Prosecutors read it aloud in its entirety, every word dripping with cold calculation and moral rationalization. Several jurors visibly shivered as the calm, almost bureaucratic prose revealed List's step-by-step justification for ending the lives of those closest to him. In the courtroom, John List alternated between impassivity and brief flashes of emotion. Sometimes he seemed resigned, other times he gazed down as if reliving the steps of his deadly plan, flickers of regret passing through his eyes. When the prosecution replayed the sacred music he'd selected to echo through the vacant mansion, the haunting strains of Bach seemed to fill the air, drawing a collective breath from all in attendance, reminding everyone of the eerie tranquility that had shrouded the crime scene. The effect was both sobering and deeply unsettling, causing even seasoned detectives to exchange uneasy glances. Testimonies for the prosecution included first responders who'd found the bodies arranged with such chilling care. They spoke of the frigid house, the persistent smell of emptiness, and the way List's preparations seemed both meticulous and profoundly detached. There were interviews with neighbors from Westfield, people recalling the weeks of worry, the eerie glow from the mansion's windows, and the slow realization that something had gone horribly wrong. Mental health professionals took the stand as well, dissecting the psychology of List's letter, labeling it a classic study in narcissism and clinical detachment. It was emotionless, one expert stated, more like an accountant balancing a ledger than a confession of murder. The defense, facing overwhelming evidence, attempted to portray John List as a broken man beset by financial ruin and mental illness. His lead attorney detailed the humiliation of unemployment, the suffocating pressures of maintaining middle-class respectability, and List's mounting despair. They called witnesses who knew the family's history, old friends, distant relatives, church members who recalled a good man before he seemed to unravel. At times, John List's demeanor supported this narrative. He broke down briefly on the stand, voice shaking as he described the hopelessness he felt before committing the unthinkable. Still, each word was colored by an undercurrent of self-justification, never quite surrendering to remorse, always edging back to rationalization. Amid this storm of testimony, the confession letter loomed over every exchange. The prosecution highlighted passages where List wrote with chilling clarity about his decision to send his family to heaven. The jury scrutinized his handwriting, the obsessively neat margins, the absence of words like sorry or love. A forensic linguist testified that the language of the letter suggested not a man in crisis, but a man striving to maintain control, even over the story of his own downfall. Photographs of the letter, projected at massive size on the courtroom screens, bore out the point. Here was a final accounting, cold and methodical, a ledger balanced in blood. Expert witnesses debated whether List suffered from undiagnosed mental illness, or if he was simply a master of calculated evil. Some pointed to his background, his stern Lutheran faith, his upbringing by a disciplinarian father, the demands of his social class. Others, however, focused on his actions after the crime, the meticulous erasure of his identity, the perfectly executed escape, and the 18 years spent as Robert Clark. If he was so tormented, one prosecutor mused, why did he so carefully plan not just the murders, but the escape? Dolores, List's second wife, spoke briefly and with visible anguish. She described a man who was quiet, reliable, perhaps a little haunted, but never anything like the cold-blooded killer described in court. On cross-examination, she admitted knowing little about her husband's past, her pain evident as she realized the magnitude of her deception. In closing arguments, the prosecution reminded the jury of the months of charade, the lights burning in the mansion, the letters to schools excusing the children, the efforts to delay discovery. They invoked the memory of 5 innocent lives lost not just to bullets, but to a plan that transformed love into horror. The defense, in turn, pleaded for mercy, urging the jurors to see not just a monster but a man. When the jury retired for deliberation, the courtroom exhaled collectively, a hush falling as people waited for the final judgment on a saga that had haunted the nation for decades. Deliberations took less than 9 hours. On April 12, 1990, John List was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder, receiving the maximum sentence for each life taken. As the verdict was read, he showed little outward reaction, only a distant nod, a man stripped at last of any final illusions of control. In the aftermath, the trial and its infamous letter became central elements in the American mythos of suburban darkness, a cautionary tale whispered in classrooms, dissected in criminology courses, and adapted for countless books, movies, and documentaries. The image of John List in the dock, flanked by his chilling confession, became a modern symbol of how the veneer of normalcy can crack to reveal horrors beneath. Lasting impact, an American cultural obsession. When the doors of New Jersey State Prison finally closed behind John List for the last time and he died in 2008, it may have marked the physical end of one man's bizarre saga, but his shadow only seemed to lengthen in the American imagination. The events that began on a cold December day in 1971 didn't just steal away a family, they became a myth, a warning, a prism through which America looked at itself and saw both old certainties and new forms of unease dissolved. The List case, in the decades since, has continued to haunt our collective memory in ways that run far deeper than mere fascination with crime. It's become a symbol, a ghost story, a study in the cracks that run beneath a culture's polished veneer. It's tempting to reduce John List's legacy to a simple set of cautionary tales. Beware the mask of respectability. Monsters sometimes wear suits. But the reasons his crimes have persisted so vividly in the cultural bloodstream are more layered and elusive. The List murders didn't happen in a neglected, chaotic neighborhood, but in the kind of meticulously landscaped suburb that served as an aspirational postcard for the American dream. Westfield, New Jersey, prided itself on civic pride, family values, quiet success, and it was precisely the shattering of this image that left such an indelible bruise on the national psyche. From the moment the news broke, a whole family murdered in their stately home, bodies arranged with chilling care, the father vanished without a trace, America became transfixed. The press descended on Westfield like moths to a suburban flame, dissecting the case in lurid headlines and somber specials. More than the blood and subterfuge, it was the chilling normalcy of it all that stung. The soccer practices, the Sunday services, the PTA meetings, and behind it, the slow slide from order to horror. John List forced Americans to confront the possibility that the greatest dangers might be invisible, masked by routine and respectability. Over the years, the List case has proved magnetic to psychologists, journalists, artists, and true crime enthusiasts alike. Best-selling books, like Death of a Family and Righteous Carnage, rake through every detail. Documentary filmmakers returned again and again to the hollowed-out mansion on Hillside Avenue, camera lights flickering on stained glass windows and faded wallpaper. The story inspired countless episodes of crime series, ghost hunting shows, and ultimately even helped lay the foundation for archetypes in pop culture. The outwardly perfect family with secrets, the lurking menace in white-collar conformity. Cultural echoes of the List murders have appeared in films from Hollywood thrillers to indie dramas, where haunted houses harbor unspeakable secrets and quiet patriarchs become agents of chaos. Newspapers and news magazines continued to reference the case whenever a new family annihilator was uncovered, John List's name quietly invoked to explain the inexplicable. Perhaps most eerily, the List mansion itself became a symbol, with new owners reporting strange feelings, ghost stories circulating at Halloween, and the address earning permanent notoriety in local lore. Yet the longevity of the List case isn't simply about the ghoulish thrill of horror. It strikes a nerve about the fragility of identity, the tension between private despair and public face, and the societal expectation that shame must be hidden at any cost. John List became a figurehead for anxieties about masculinity, the sacrifices and pride of 20th century fatherhood, and the corners into which the provider culture can back a desperate, isolated man. The infamous 5-page confession letter, read and reread in classrooms and courtrooms, entered American folklore not just as a document of confession, but as an example of cold rationalization and moral compartmentalization. The fact that List addressed it to his pastor only deepened the sense of dislocation, the fusion of faith, duty, and violence reflecting decades of societal tension around religion and responsibility. His calm handwriting, void of emotional breaks or overt remorse, has been analyzed by criminal profilers and literature professors alike as a kind of modern American artifact, the dark calligraphy of madness, shame, and control. Even as the years passed and List's escape and eventual capture became legend, his story helped trigger new anxieties about anonymity and trust. The success of his new life as Robert Clark, the ease with which he embedded into new communities, remains a warning about both the power and limits of neighborly surveillance. If John List could reinvent himself for 2 decades in plain sight, people whispered, who else might be hiding in suburbia? The List case inspired not just art but policy. It accelerated improvements in criminal databases, identification protocols, and interstate police communication. On television, the turning point in List's story, his eventual identification after a forensic artist's clay bust was broadcast on America's Most Wanted, became a watershed moment in both crime fighting and media history. Lists of TV's most memorable moments still cite the episode when viewers watched that aged bust, only for the real man to be picked out of millions by an alert neighbor. For law enforcement, the capture brought a sense of vindication and awe. Technology and community, working together, could finally shrink the space where evil hides. For media theorists, it was proof of television's power to make the invisible suddenly visible, to collapse years of deception in a single electrifying hour. But the final, and perhaps deepest, impact of the List murders is how they forced America's cultural conversation to shift. Before Westfield, the myth of the all-American family under one roof, protected by faith and tradition, seemed nearly unbreakable. Afterward, those myths became a little more complicated. Academics and artists alike point to the List case as a turning point, an early breach in the optimism of post-war suburbia, a fracture line foreshadowing the unease of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Novels, plays, and songs began to grapple with the possibility that the home was not always a sanctuary, and that the darkness inside could be more dangerous than any threat outside. In classrooms and lecture halls, the List saga is dissected as both warning and lesson. Professors use it to examine intersections of psychology, religion, law, and media. Theology students discuss the tragic distortion of faith. In literature, the story is mined for themes of alienation, performative virtue, and the silent unraveling that can consume even the most tightly wound lives. In psychology courses, List is analyzed not just as a monster, but as an extreme, if horrifying product of cultural pressures and psychiatric blind spots. Every few years, the case is revived by a new documentary or adaptation, each generation finding something relevant in the story, whether it's distrust of institutions, the fallout of economic collapse, or the ever-present anxiety that the neighbors we think we know could be harboring unfathomable secrets. The legend is retold for new times, in streaming miniseries, in podcasts dissecting every nuance, in haunted house walkthroughs, and even in memes. For Westfield itself, the scars run deepest. Residents who lived through that strange, anxious month still recall the dread of seeing every light ablaze at the List mansion, or the sudden silences at neighborhood gatherings. Even after the house was demolished, the empty lot became a site of uneasy pilgrimage, a reminder that beneath the American dream, anxiety and vulnerability have always lurked. The List name is spoken softly, like a ghost story parents tell to warn children that safety too is a story we tell ourselves. For America at large, John List is more than a criminal. He is a figure who lingers at the edges of the great suburban narrative, a quiet warning that the search for control and perfection can sometimes open doors to disaster. His story is part myth, part lesson, and part unsolved riddle, the nightmare that flares to life each time a smiling family photo or a darkened window flashes across the screen. The List case endures because it asks questions that have no easy answers. How well do we really know each other? What lies behind the masks we wear, sometimes even for ourselves? Can order and faith become cages as much as they're shelters? Even now, decades later, as true crime continues to fascinate America, the story of John List hovers in our imaginations, not only as fact but as a symbol, reflecting our deepest fears about the people and the secrets next door. So much of American culture is still in conversation with those ghosts from Westfield, in the stories we tell, in the ways we try to keep darkness at bay, in the uneasy knowledge that even the brightest homes sometimes hide the longest shadows. Judgment and aftermath. The sentence that finally marked the end of John Jamelski's reign did not come with cheers or applause. Justice, in cases so dark and protracted, is never a clear line. More often, it is felt as a tremor of relief mixed with the ragged edges of loss that may never fully be smoothed. When Jamelski was brought before the court, the proceedings had the somber air of a reckoning long overdue, a courtroom packed not just with legal professionals, but with survivors, families, weary law enforcement officials, and local media eager to see evil forced at last into the light. The trial itself was a marathon of testimony and evidence, as each piece of Jamelski's hidden world was unveiled before the jury. For many of the survivors, facing their captor in person, recounting their stories under oath, was as grueling as the ordeal itself. Anxiety hummed through each witness, the fear that their voices so long suppressed or ignored might again be dismissed. Prosecutors meticulously presented the evidence, crime scene photos of the makeshift dungeon, steel chains and padlocks, dirty bedding, scattered remnants of daily life underground. Each survivor's testimony corroborated the nightmare, giving form to a horror that was no longer just rumor or fantasy. Forensic experts, social workers, and detectives traced the steps of the investigation, showing how Jamelski's pattern was allowed to continue by a blend of cunning and institutional oversights. Family members spoke with the frail hope that their loved ones, though forever changed, might finally find peace in being believed. The judge's instructions to the jury were stern and solemn, a reminder that their decision was not just about one man's guilt or innocence, but about the value the community attached to every life crossed by tragedy. When the verdict was read, guilty on 5 counts of first-degree kidnapping and related charges, there was no triumphant outburst in the courtroom, only quiet sobs and an exhale that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the building's old stone walls. The sentence itself, 18 to 99 years, was as close to justice as the system could offer for so many years stolen. Yet as Jamelski was led away, still inscrutable behind thick glasses, the room pulsed with the knowledge that closure for most would not be written in legal documents or by courtroom drama. The aftermath of his sentencing rippled outward, both intimate and publicly visible. For the families, it was a relief that the daily dread, searching faces in the crowd, waiting for a knock or a letter or a confession, could finally recede. For survivors, the knowledge that their tormentor would most likely die behind bars offered a grim reassurance, but it did not erase the years spent in darkness or the scars, visible and invisible, that they continued to carry. Some chose never to speak to the press. Others, with time, became advocates for missing persons and victims' rights, their voices now shaped by experience, not silence. News of the conviction spread rapidly through DeWitt and beyond. The community, once defined by the veneer of suburban safety, was forced to confront its own complacency and the holes in its social fabric. Local organizations held vigils for the missing and the returned, while town meetings included difficult conversations about law enforcement's failures, systemic bias, and the ways entire neighborhoods could have overlooked the warning signs. The Jamelski case became a touchstone, a lesson in vigilance, empathy, and the lasting need for accountability at every level of society. Financial restitution, ordered as part of the judgment, was also a necessary but imperfect salve. Jamelski's seized assets were distributed to those he had victimized, meant to compensate for therapy, medical expenses, and lost time. Yet no amount of money could ever return what he had stolen: education, relationships, a sense of safety, or years that should have been freely lived. For several families, compensation enabled moves to new states or investment in long overdue care. For others, it merely marked the closure of a chapter, not its true resolution. The legal case drew attention from national and even international true crime enthusiasts. Writers, filmmakers, and legal scholars dissected every detail, eager to understand how a man with such an ordinary facade had caused so much devastation beneath his unremarkable home. Documentaries were produced, podcasts debated how much blame rested with the perpetrator alone, and how much belonged to larger institutional failures. Yet within DeWitt, these efforts sometimes felt at odds with the pain still echoing among neighbors and survivors. For them, the cameras often lingered too long, missing the quiet daily work of healing and rebuilding trust. The resonance of the case even reached state and federal legislatures, prompting new discussions and in some places the creation of laws aimed at improving missing persons protocols, enhancing victim support networks, and mandating better communication between agencies. Some survivors consulted directly on these reforms, lending their lived experience to the bureaucratic machinery of prevention and justice. The impact was gradual, but real, a shift in how both officials and the public viewed the importance of every disappearance, no longer just another missing persons report, but a call for urgent, compassionate response. Jamelski, for his part, remained largely silent after sentencing. Appeals were filed and denied. He never confessed to the full extent of his crimes, leaving some families with questions that could never be answered. As the years passed, news of his life in prison grew sparse, reduced to brief mentions and the occasional rumor. Notably, his 2020 petition for parole, broadcast in a cold officialese, was swiftly denied, reaffirming that some acts remain unforgivable regardless of time spent behind bars. But true aftermath, the real marrow of justice, lay elsewhere, in the slow, arduous process of naming and claiming the pain that had gone unspoken for too long. For the survivors, healing was not a straight line. Some battled nightmares, anxiety, and isolation. Others rediscovered agency in activism or creative work. Many built new lives far from DeWitt's maple-lined streets, but a few chose to stay, their presence a quiet rebuke to the secrecy that once ruled. Each anniversary of Jamelski's arrest became an opportunity to gather, reflect, and insist on better for future generations. Over time, a sort of scar tissue resilience took hold. In the grown-up faces of former captives, in new community initiatives, and in rituals of remembrance for those still missing. Slowly, the echo of Jamelski's reign dimmed, replaced by stories not of captivity, but of resistance and recovery. Out of darkness, violent, senseless, and suffocating, emerged a stubborn light, the enduring belief that, though justice cannot restore what was lost, telling the truth and being heard remain acts of vital, ongoing power.